Welcome. Welcome to my kitchen, and today we're going to be making apple Johnny cake or apple hoe cake. Now the recipe I'm using is from 1916 from a Good Housekeeping magazine, and I'll put a link to it down in the description if you want to see the recipe there. If you want to look at the magazine, it's a good read. It just shows you how much our country's changed over the last 120 some years. But Johnny cake and hoe cake and corn pone, that goes back much farther than 1916 for the recipe we're using today. Actually, the residents or the settlement in Roanoke Island, the one that disappeared, there's writings there where they talk about the natives showing them how to use cornmeal to make bread, to make cake, to eat. And so it's interesting how far back it goes. So the recipe we're using today, though, is from 1916, and we're going to get right into it. Now the recipe from 1916, and I'll put it up on the screen, doesn't give us any temperatures or it does give us a time. So I'm going to use my best guess here as to what I think it should be. But I preheated my oven to 350, so that's what I would suggest. And depending on how you're going to cook it, what you're going to cook it in, I'm going to use a 9-inch cast iron skillet. And anytime I cook something in my skillet, I always preheat it. So I'm going to go ahead and put my skillet, I already preheated the oven. I'm going to put my skillet in the oven so that this gets nice and warm. If you're not using a cast iron skillet, you're just going to use like a 9-inch baking pan. Don't preheat it, of course, but just get that prepped and coat it with whatever type of oil that you prefer. So I'm going to go ahead and put my skillet in the oven, and I'll be right back. Now the recipe from 1916 calls for using 3 apples, sweet apples, and I use crimson gold. I love them for baking, so that's what I'm using. And the other thing is, I think the apples we have nowadays are quite a bit bigger than the apples they had back in 1916. I might be wrong, but I think that's probably true. So what I did is I took 2 apples and pared them and quartered and cut them pretty thin here so you can see the way I did it. But I got 2 large apples here. So if you have smaller apples, just go ahead with the 3. But I'm just letting you know I went ahead with the 2. So this recipe is super easy, not many ingredients to it. First thing you want to do after you preheat your oven to 350, you got your apples ready to go. You want to take 2 cups of cornmeal. Now I want to recommend always using stone ground cornmeal. There's degermed cornmeal out there too. I won't say what the brands are. And they degerm it because it lasts longer that way. I always use stone ground because, I mean, historically that's what we use. So I got 2 cups of stone ground cornmeal. I'm just going to dump in. And the next thing is a cup of all-purpose flour. So I got that right here. The next item in the recipe just calls for 2 teaspoons of baking powder. So I have that ready to go right here. Just dump that in. And a teaspoon of salt. That's it. That's it for dry ingredients. So let me go ahead. I'm just going to mix that together just to make sure we got a nice combination here. And it's interesting, the first recipe book, or what many people consider the first recipe book, was written by Amelia Simmons in 1798. And she's got 5 recipes in there that have cornmeal in them. And one's hoe cake, Johnny cake, Indian pudding, and a couple other recipes in there. But it just shows you from the very beginning, even like I said, back to Roanoke Island, cornmeal, I mean, that was it. In my mind anyway, I don't think America would have been what it was without cornmeal and what the natives showed us how to use that to make hoe cake and Johnny cake and pone bread and corn pone and that type of thing. So once you got the dry ingredients mixed, the recipe calls for 1.5 cups of milk, and just to mix that in. So we're just going to go ahead and do that. And then once we added the milk, we're going to go ahead and add our apples. So now that we have this mixed, I'm just going to bring the preheated skillet over and we're just going to put this in. And again, if you're using cast iron, just make sure you pre-treat it if you're going to heat it up ahead of time with whatever oil is your preference. If you're not using a cast iron skillet, then of course you don't want to preheat it. You still want to oil it though. But then you just want to dump in your Johnny cake. And just kind of level it up a little bit. And then we're going to put it back in the oven. Again, it's a 350. And the recipe calls for 35-40 minutes. So we'll check it around 30-35 minutes, see how it's doing. Well, we've been letting our apple Johnny cake bake, and it ended up, for me anyway, taking 40 minutes at 350 degrees. And I tested it, it's all ready to go. So let me pull it out and I'll bring it over. Now those apples, apples just smell delicious. You probably really can't get a good look at it here, but there it is, and it looks delicious. Now the way I test to make sure that it's done, I just use a butter knife. I don't have a cake tester. I used to, I don't know where it is, but all I do is just go ahead and stick it in there, and as long as it doesn't stick, we're good to go. Yeah, that's good. So the recipe says, if I have it here, it says this should be served very hot with butter, and or maybe cooled and served crumbled in milk for children's supper. So what we're going to do is we're going to serve it hot. I don't know how very hot is right out of the oven. Might be a little bit too hot for me. So I'm going to let this cool just for a moment. And then once it cools, I'm going to cut a piece, put some butter on it, and we're going to try it. Well, I cut a piece and I put a little bit of butter on top. This is real Johnny cake because there's no added sugar. The only sweetness in here comes from the apples. So you can see how delicious, I should say you can see how delicious that is. I don't know how well you can see that. It cuts great out of the cast iron. So let me just take a quick bite. They knew what they were doing when they added apples to Johnny cake. So excellent recipe. And like I said, Johnny cake, hoe cake, the apples got added probably a little bit later, but a great recipe and absolutely delicious. Just with butter. The recipe also says you can crumble it up, put it in milk. I'm sure that's going to be delicious. I'm going to try that tomorrow morning for my breakfast. So thanks for joining me for this recipe for apple Johnny cakes from 1916. And you know, as you know, and as I shared, Johnny cakes, hoe cakes, pone, corn pone, that goes back to the beginning of our country and even before that. Cornmeal, I mean, that's a staple that our country was founded on. So thanks for joining me again. If you did like this video, please go ahead and like it. If you want to see more videos of historic recipes like this, looking at corn pone and recipes that really made our nation what it is, please go ahead and subscribe to the channel, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.